This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. When we up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into
the wrong station. Something I often think about as I sit in the commander's seat of this 100-year-old tank, drinking warm rice lager and eating cold leftover octopus, is how our little actions can spin out, shaping the course of many lives. When I was young, floating Kuzon was a wonder of the world. 1 million people, all color and light. Laundry in bright strands between the rusted bulkheads, vines flowing against the clouded sky, pink blooms of shrimp in the city's wake, and the seaplanes raising golden wakes as they landed at sunset. And the people, all kinds and colors, refugees from all lands in this city on the sea. All of it ended because one young man wanted a job. I had to be quiet that morning as I crept around inside the tank, gathering my things. Uncle Tekka was sleeping it off in the commander's chair, but even when he drank heavy, he slept light. He'd been in the war. I could tell he was having the nightmare again as I strained for my shoes under his chair, his hands twitching at flak guns as the air marines fell toward him. I got my shoes. They were a size too small. I was halfway through stuffing my feet into them when the spider crab crawled past my face and up to the armrest. Crunch! My uncle's fist like a mortar shell. The crab was smashed flat against old rubber. He came half awake and blinked at his dripping fingers. Lunch. Then he fell back into the headrest, snoring like an outboard motor. A few drops of crab juice plinked to the steel floor. I fled. Because Tekka had been one of Kuzon's first arrivals after the war, we were lucky enough to live near the surface. Some of our neighbors were 100 feet down in old PA subs, deep enough you had to climb slowly or you'd get the bends. But we were privileged. Only a few feet of steel ladder, and I was blinking in daylight. One of our upside neighbors had an actual shower, albeit an outdoor one, and I'd paid them off with a few pounds of deep-fried spider crab for its use. Behind the plastic curtain, I stripped down and washed myself using a 30-year-old bar of military soap I'd stolen from Uncle. That was the moment I betrayed him. I even knew it at the time. My face burned as I scrubbed it clean. Afterward, I shrugged into fresh clothes stolen for the Banana Tree laundromat. They were too big, but the fashion in poor Kuzon was for extra cloth. If I tucked in the shirt, rolled the sleeves, and pinned the pant cuffs, maybe I could make the outfit look on purpose. I dragged a comb through my knotted hair and frowned at myself in the broken mirror. I didn't look good, but I looked like I'd made an effort. Maybe that was enough. The Glauman building, like most in Kuzon, was not a building. Unlike most, it was clean and white without rust. Most people would have sold an unused yacht. Not Davison Glauman. He'd pulled out the engines, bolted on pontoons, and turned it into the base of a floating estate. Even built a kind of skyscraper as a counterweight to the hull. When he'd plowed the whole structure into Kuzon's flank, it changed the city's balance, forcing several poorer neighborhoods even deeper underwater. Now the compound gleamed at Kuzon's heart, an unofficial embassy to the west, all under the stripes and hearts of the new Frisian flag. That morning was humid, and I was already sweating. I hurried. Maybe I'd be lucky and finish my interview before the whole shirt soaked through. I gave my name at the gate, and they buzzed me into an atrium full of young men in too large shirts and rolled-up pants, all of them faintly sweaty and clutching damp resumes. I waited for an hour. By the time they called me into Mr. Sheary's air-conditioned office, the back of my shirt was soaked. Mr. Sheary, the major domo, wasn't a Westerner, but he spoke like one. He didn't look up from his papers as I sat across his desk. "So, why do you want this job?" For the same reason as every other young man in that waiting room. It was an opportunity, a paycheck, a rung on the ladder up. But instead of all that, I told him, "Well, Mr. Sheary, I've been an admirer of Colonel Glauman for as long as I can remember, sir." He glanced up over the round black frames of his glasses. "Have you?" "Yes, sir. Kuzon's very own war hero. I have a second-hand FAC jacket that I've worn since I was 12. This was technically true. I'd picked it out at random from a second-hand bin. And a poster of a Groningen bomber on my bedroom wall. Mr. Sheary leaned in, now wearing a faint smile. "Groningen, eh? Is that what Colonel Glauman flew?" "No, sir. He was the pilot of an NF Gamma Sky Citadel, Route Pier 4125-251. But they didn't have any NF Gamma posters, so I settled for the Groningen." "Ha! Ha ha!" Mr. Sheary leaned back, loosening up at last. "Well, many's the pilot who could say the same. You know your stuff, don't you, son?" "I do my best, sir." It was bullshit. I'd studied up because I thought it might get me noticed. "Well, keep doing your best and you'll rise, my boy." He offered his hand across the desk. "Welcome aboard." When I got home, our unventilated tank was full of spitting oil and the smell of frying crab. Uncle was already halfway through his breakfast can of Crate Brand Extra Dry. It had a banded sea snake on the label. "Where have you been?" "Just out." I tried to sound natural. "Actually, I got a job." "Oh, yeah?" He tossed me a fruit juice from the cooler of seawater which passed for our fridge. "Not happy scooping crabs with Uncle anymore?" "Well, can't say I blame you. Just didn't know there was better work in Kuzon right now. Had my ear to the deck for you, too. Figured I might have heard it first." "Oh, it's nothing much, but it gets me above water." The problem with Tekka was that he was too smart. He immediately smelled that I didn't want to talk about the job, so he did exactly what I was afraid of. He threw up his hands and made a big production. All right. Don't want your old uncle showing up at work and embarrassing you in front of your new friends. I get it. He shot a glance over his shoulder, grinning with yellow teeth. Any pretty girls there? In spite of myself, I turned red. He cackled. In fact, there was a pretty girl. I'd seen her that morning in the small park of grass and trees which Glauman's architects had conjured from the floating concrete pad. Bree Glauman, the big man's daughter. She was around my own age. She was studying political science. She was clean, composed. She was everything Kuzon wasn't. All right, Tekka laughed, turning back to the crab. You'll tell me in your own time, I'm sure. Facing away, he couldn't see the tightness of my smile. My plan was this. Get rid of it all. Every stitch and whiff of Kuzonness. I skipped breakfast so my breath never smelled of spider crab. I borrowed against my first paycheck to make a deal with the laundromat where I'd stolen my clothes. Every morning before sunrise, I bathed in their sinks and ironed my shirt and brushed my teeth with baking soda. I got to the Glauman estate by dawn, while the dew still gleamed on its polite, kept grass. I worked hard. As often as I could, I shadowed Mr. Shiri, quietly mouthing his words and trying to catch hold of that accent. Lunch breaks I spent in the library, poring through encyclopedias, trying to shed my ignorance like a crate sheds its skin. In my second week, Bree Glauman caught me in the stacks. Excuse me, miss, I've just been sent in the dust. But she narrowed her eyes at me, smiling. You don't have a rag or anything. I made a show of having forgotten to bring one, but she just laughed. It was a nice sound, like rain on the waves. It's all right. She leaned closer, whispering. She smelled of expensive soap. I've seen you reading before. Your secret safe. Then she gave me a significant glance and disappeared into the books. Was kindness easy because she'd only lived in plenty? Or was it just her nature? I still don't know. Nephew, tell me something. Uncle Tekka was in a thoughtful mood that night, one hand slowly spinning his beer on the table, one hand scritching the salt and pepper bristles of his beard. What is this thing you're doing these days, with your mouth? I flinched. We were sitting at the wreckage of a fried crab dinner, listening to our radio crackle with the effort it took to reach through waves and steel. Only scraps of music made it through. I was staring at the wall, very full of crab, and mouthing the lyrics to try and get a feel for how Mr. Shiri would say them. Caught, I had no lie ready. I'm, practicing words. Practicing them? You mean you don't know how to speak? Have I failed you so badly? No, I mean, practicing pronouncing them. Like they'd say in New Frisia. Considering a career as an actor, the same words are the same words. So what? Well, I don't want to sound ignorant. Ignorant? The way I talk is ignorant? No, it's just, you think I can't talk different? You think I can't speak like a New Frisian University man? I choose to talk like this. It's how people talk in the place I love. I couldn't say anything to that. He frowned and leaned forward. Who's been telling you this, that you should be ashamed of how you are? Nobody. It's not like that. If it's this new job, or this girl, I cut him off, a little sharply. It isn't them. He drew back, raising one hand in forbearance. All right. I'll leave it at that. And he did, which I loved him for. And we went on living for a while, a few weeks and months, with me refusing to tell him this thing that would hurt him, that I'd betrayed Kuzon in my heart, and him suspecting the truth, but loving me too much to pry. It worked. For a while. From time to time, Uncle Tekka wouldn't come home at night. The old tomcat had his charms, for women of a certain age, and I think he had arrangements in the city. I truly didn't want to know, and rarely thought about it. And so, when I woke one morning and found he wasn't snoring in his chair, I rushed as normal to the laundromat and brushed my teeth and washed and shrugged into clothes I'd left to dry the night before. And when I stepped back out into the sapphire light, I ran straight into Uncle Tekka walking home. His eyes widened at my appearance in the twilight. I was an apparition. My white shirt, my pressed trousers. He'd never seen this me before. Emotions flicked across his face like clouds ahead of the wind. Horror, anger, fear, and sadness. Then he rallied and smiled feebly and clapped my shoulder as he passed. I felt an ulcer open in my heart, but I didn't call out after him. I went to work. By one of those coincidences, that was the same day I first met Davison Glauman. I was kneeling in the blue pile of the upper boardroom carpet, restocking the mini-fridge. Polished mahogany gave light back gently. The air conditioner sighed. There was a clamor of voices in the hall outside, and somebody said, "Just a moment, I need some sparkling water." Then, Davison Glauman was towering over me, handsome and wavy-haired, just as you'd see him shaking hands with the Chancellor of New Holland or New Frisia on TV. He had blue eyes, the same shade as Breeze. "Aha!" He seemed almost surprised to find a servant in his house. "You must be the new boy." Yes, sir." Mr. Sherry appeared at his shoulder, giving me a look that said to clear out. "Sorry, sir, I'll be out of your way in a moment." "Not at all. I've been hearing a lot about you, son." "Don't worry. Good things only. Say, pass me a bottle of Bornwetter, would you?" "Thanks. Not too cold? Just right." He'd settled into one of the boardroom's plush leather swivels, and now leaned toward me with a benevolent mischief in his eye. "Say, kid, would you like to hear about the Kuzon raid?" "Sir," Mr. Sherry interrupted. "It's a thrilling story, but there is a little bit more business we should—" "Nonsense!" Glauman waved his hand. "We've got time. That's the trick of this leadership thing, you know," he told me. "You have to make time for people." I nodded, sincerely. I wasn't used to attention, let alone from important people. And so, at his insistence, I helped myself to a turmeric soda and sat across from him, leaning forward with my hands between my knees as I listened. "Here's the thing they never tell you about the Kuzon raid," he began. "It was a total accident." "An accident?" "That's right. You see, this whole island was nothing more than a rock spit before the war. Then the Pacific Alliance came in and poured a few million tons of concrete, and over the course of a summer, it became the biggest gun platform between here and the West Coast. An island fortress. We threw everything we had at it for months. Couldn't break it. Couldn't even chip it. The guns put down a storm of flak you wouldn't believe, and they never ran out because the PA resupplied by submarine. Impregnable. That's how it seemed. So eventually the mandate was, leave Kuzon alone. Fly around. End the war without breaking this damn rock. And that's where things stood. when a certain junior officer managed to get his gunship lost in bad weather over the straits. He gestured to himself. Our protagonist. Now, we had no idea where we were until a cloud of flak opened up around us. Boom, boom, boom. We tried to fly through, but between one heartbeat and the next... He snapped his fingers. Half our plane was gone, and half the crew with her, and we were spiraling down toward a stormy sea. Here's where the plot thickens. Chance or fate? I still don't know. But it just happens that on that day, we were returning to the front after a stint in dry dock for repairs, and hitching a ride with us was a crack section of Air Marines returning from R&R. So no sooner are we hit than those boys are in motion. Somebody straps a chute to my back and whoom, we're out of the fuselage, falling like bullets toward a gray speck in the middle of the ocean. Kuzon. It's soaking, freezing, the wind howling, and there's a roar I only later realized was heavy guns pointed on us. I thought for sure I was dead. I would have been, except the sergeant of the Air Marines was latched onto me and steering and screaming directions in my ear. Felt like a million years before we pulled our chutes. God, we couldn't have been more than 50 feet above the rain-washed concrete, but you have to pull late and land hard when you're coming in hot. Otherwise, you're just a sitting duck in midair. Even as it was, half of us were shot down. I still remember the look in the sergeant's eye when he got hit. And then, boom, crack, we came down on the platform, hit hard and rolled, cutting free from the chute, and those boys were so good that they were already shooting before they were back up on their feet. Me, I could barely stand. Turned out later I'd broken my leg on landing. Not that I could feel it at the time. Adrenaline, you know. And you know what we found? He paused for effect, spread his hands. Practically nothing. A few gunners with sidearms, barely any resistance. This fortress we'd built up in our heads, it was a paper castle. There was only a skeleton crew. Most personnel had been evacuated by sub when the PA realized we were skirting Kuzon. Greatest citadel on the sea, and we took it by accident with barely a dozen men. He clapped his hands and leaned back. Well, the Air Marines made short work, and within half an hour of getting shot down, they'd brought me the last surviving officer. Poor kid, he was even younger than me. Well, he gave me a sword, and that was that. He laughed again, shaking his head. Still have the sword. It's hanging in the library. Well, you should have heard the surprise in their voices at command when I radioed in. All casual. But you might like to know I've taken floating Kuzon. Like it was nothing. He smiled, leaned back, and gazed into the past. Well, there you have it. The whole story. A little less glamorous than the official version, eh? I don't think you come off too badly, sir. Good man, he told me, with the same smile as his daughter. Then he had an idea and snapped his fingers. Well, say, every year on the anniversary, I hold a sort of get-together, a picnic for some of the movers and shakers in this city. You seem like a young man on the make. Why don't you come, eh? And bring your folks. No, I won't hear no for an answer. How about it? What could I say to that? There was no way to turn him down. I couldn't tell the truth about my uncle or the spider crabs. I could only force myself to smile and tell him I'd like that very much. That night, I arrived back at the tank as my normal self, in gray tee and baggy shorts, with my good shirt and trousers hanging up to dry in the back of the laundromat. Uncle Tekka was where I always found him when I got home. At the fryer, lowering a basket of wretched little things into the oil. Under the golden waves, their armored forms were like the tanks and containers and old vehicles we all lived in. Uncle. Listen, my new job. You mean the one you're so ashamed about you creep around before sunrise? My voice got stuck in my throat. After a second, he laughed bitterly. Of course, my mistake. It's not the job you're ashamed of. Uncle, that's not... He waved me off, lowered a second basket of crabs into spitting oil. You don't have to explain yourself, nephew. What did you want to talk about? Well, there wasn't much point putting off the question. There's an event in a couple weeks at my work, a sort of picnic lunch, and we're invited as an appreciation thing. He watched the little crabs boil. A picnic. His voice could have stripped paint. Then something clicked in his head. Who has picnics in Kuzon? It's not... Is this at the Glauman estate? Like I said, he was too sharp. I nodded. You're working for Davis and Glauman. That's who you press your white shirt for. Yeah. I was ashamed, but also proud. I've met him, actually. He's nice. His daughter's nice, too. That last part slipped out, and I wished I could have pulled it back. I changed the subject quickly. He told me all about the war. But Uncle Tekka saw through me again and threw his head back. My nephew is working for Davis and Glauman and has fallen in love with his daughter. Well, dip my hand in boiling oil and tell me that it's crab. Uncle, would you come with me to the picnic? But he wasn't done. And? Whoa! He told you about the war. Well, I'm glad someone's finally feeding you the truth. It would mean a lot to me if you came. He raised crabs from the oil, dumped them out in an old rag. Are you sure you want me to come? Of course I do. You're my uncle. He grew quiet. And you're sure you're not ashamed of me? He murmured. I'll never forget this. How it took me just a moment too long to answer. No, I said. Too late. Of course not. He pulled the second batch of crabs, watched their ruined bodies tumble as he dumped them out to drain. Thought about it. Then looked back at me with a hollow smile. All right, nephew. I'll come to your party. Clean and sober, too. I'll try to make you proud of me. For once. I thanked him and gave him a big hug he didn't really return. That was the end of our talk. It was the last real conversation that we had. The next morning, Tekka was asleep as normal when I left. But when I got home that night, I found him steaming vegetables, not frying crab. And there was no can of crate bounced on a heap of recycling beside him, only an old glass bottle full of water. When I asked him about his day, he smiled and made insubstantial talk, and after that went out. Came home an hour later, covered in a sheen of sweat. He'd been jogging. He went to use the neighbor's shower. The next morning, he was awake before I was, shaving his face in the reflection of a small steel mirror leaned up against the bulkhead. It was the first time I'd seen him shave in years. It was like he'd flipped a switch. He was a different man. When the day came, I woke to find Uncle Tekka's old battered chair was empty. An uneasy feeling crept up my spine. But it wasn't a day to be late. I climbed topside, scrubbed in the laundromat sink, and was just putting on my clothes when Uncle Tekka's unexpected voice almost startled me to death. Put this on instead. When I glanced back, he was standing in the doorway, almost unrecognizable in a crisp white shirt and timeless charcoal suit. He was holding out a garment bag. I stared. Come on, or we'll be late. Inside the bag were a pressed shirt and a thin black tie, and a gray suit of my own, lighter and cut slimmer for a younger man. It fit perfectly, and so did the shoes he passed me next. Uncle Tecker, where did you get all this? You want to look good for Miss Glauman, don't you? But how? He shrugged. There's a lot about your uncle you don't know. We stopped for a cup of tea on the soapbox seats at Madame Bournoux's and didn't say much. Uncle Tekka was in a quiet mood, focused on his tea, on the morning light that came up quickly over Kuzon, the market squares and rusted conning towers, crumbling PA citadel and the residential streets of houseboats, the airships kite-blown at the city harbor. What are you thinking about? I asked. Just how much I love this place. He took a deep breath and finished his cup. Come on, it's time for us to go. Then, as we walked down streets and gangways and bamboo bridges hanging in the sky, his whole demeanor changed. Suddenly he was smiling and expansive. Suddenly he was winking at handsome women that we passed. When we arrived at the gates of the Glauman estate, he produced our invitation with a flourish and coaxed a laugh from even stoic Mr. Sheary with his clipboard. Some place! He exclaimed as we stepped inside. The garden was festooned with pale bunting. Tables groaned beneath the weight of high-piled platters, and a little New Frisian flag flew bravely above each crustless sandwich. A 2-scale NF Sky Citadel made of cake soared above its blue frosting ocean. Magnificent! Look! They even got the serial number right. I never knew you were a plane buff, Uncle. Like I said, nephew, your uncle's a man of unknown depth. Ah! Should we go pay our respects to Mr. Glauman? At the far end of the garden, Mr. Glauman and his daughter were holding court on the low flight of steps which led into the main house. Davison was immaculate in a bright blue suit with tie and clip and pocket square. Bree's hair was elegantly weaved, and her white dress shone with printed peonies. Uncle Tekka put his hand on my back and steered us toward them, clearing our way to the front of the line by main force of charisma. Winks, quips, polite non-apologies. I'd never seen him work people like this before. Ah, Mr. Glauman himself. What a singular pleasure. I almost laughed to hear Uncle's university man voice. It was the one he used to imitate Davison when we heard him on the radio. But I kept my composure, and Mr. Glauman didn't suspect any insult. Ah, and you must be Uncle Tekka. We've heard so much about you from your boy. He seized Uncle's offered hand, and their handshake almost crackled with power. He's some lad you got there, Mr. Tekka. A great kid, a hard worker, with such potential. Don't I know it? Uncle half-turned and clapped a hand on my shoulder, looking at me with a genuine, almost painful love. I think his parents would be tremendously proud. Ah! He looked past me. And you must be Miss Glauman. He bowed deeply. Every bit as radiant as I've heard. I blushed a little, and so did she, glancing back at me as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Uncle Tekka laughed. Ah, to be young again, Mr. Glauman, he said, straightening with a rueful smile. All the things we might have done differently. If only, said Glauman, matching him. I often think how lucky they are to be young in a time with no war, with such opportunity. A flicker of anger crossed my uncle's face. So fast you wouldn't have caught it if you didn't know him. Then he was all smiles and vigorous nods again. You could not be more right, Mr. Glauman. You could not be more right. He snapped his fingers as if remembering something. I was reading, Mr. Glauman, in the Economic Monthly, that during the war you were the leader of the expedition that took this island. Could that be so? Well, Glauman gave a humble gesture. It's not something I like to boast about, but yes, that is correct. Tekka shook his head, eyes wide. Unbelievable. Now, the article I read made it seem like you took the place almost single-handed. At this point, I finally began to relax. Up until Uncle began to flatter Glauman about his war record, I was worried he'd do something to ruin my position here. He'd get drunk or say something vulgar, or fall into a table of champagne coupes. But here was a new man, handsome, sartorial. In so many ways, he seemed Glauman's equal and counterpart, like he was the Tekka from some nearby universe where we were also rich people living on the surface. I risked a glance at Bree and made eye contact. She looked up at the heavens as her father began to wax on about the NF Gamma Sky Citadel, and then smiled at me. I smiled back and looked down. Oh, of course, hugely exaggerated, Glauman was saying. Truth is, we took the place completely by accident. No, said Tekka. That has to be some story. Well, it does take a minute or two to tell, Glauman admitted. But actually, if you want to follow me to the library, I have some paraphernalia that you'll find quite interesting. Well, by all means, lead on. And so, ignoring the crowd of Glauman's well-wishers, the two older men bounded up the steps like boys toward the library. Should we keep an eye on them? Bree suggested, looking after her father. I realized with surprise that she was worried about her father embarrassing her. Sure. We followed them up the steps and into the cool darkness of the hallway inside. All was quiet except for the muted sound of their voices up ahead. He's not... Bree hesitated, looking at the tall figure of her father up ahead. He means well, she said, but he doesn't understand that things are different for other people. She was apologizing to me for something. I didn't understand what it was back then because I was still young and very ignorant about the world. She glanced up at me and saw I didn't understand. She glanced down again, looking vaguely sick. Never mind. When we arrived at the library doors, Davison Glauman had taken down the sword from its hook on the wall to show Uncle Tekka. Well, after that, the Air Marines made short work of the garrison, he said, and within half an hour of getting shot down, they'd brought me the last surviving officer. Poor kid, he was even younger than I was. Well, he gave me his sword, this one here, and that was that. Glauman pulled it, flashing from its scabbard. A simple, one-edged weapon. A junior officer's. Nothing ornamental. It's still sharp, Glauman said, touching its edge to the ball of his thumb. I made sure to keep it in good condition. Respectful thing to do, you know. Oh, certainly, said Uncle Tekka. He started to reach for the sword, then hesitated. May I? Oh, of course. Be my guest. Glauman reversed the blade, and gently, Uncle Tekka accepted the hilt. How can I describe this? It settled into his hand like battery into slot, shell into breech, dislocated shoulder into joint. He looked completely different with that weapon in his hand. The room had changed. All the gravity had flowed from Glauman into my uncle. The businessman shifted on his feet. He felt it too. It's been a very long time, my uncle said, since I held this. The silence thickened. You could dimly hear the garden party carry on outside, and Glauman's smile slowly faded. You mean, since you held a sword? Since I held my sword. I felt Bree go stiff and cold beside me. Uncle Tekka, I said, I don't think Mr. Glauman gets your sense of humor. He glanced at me and smiled sadly. But Mr. Glauman laughed, slightly shrill with relief. Ha! He put a hand over his chest. You almost had me there, Mr. Tekka. Almost got me. Now, come along, let's put this away. He reached for the hilt, but Uncle Tekka took a smooth step back, gently imposing the edge of light between them. They held that tableau for a long time. It really was you, wasn't it? Glauman said at last. That junior officer, all those years ago. Uncle Tekka glanced down at the sword. It seems it still is. Well, the businessman made a last, vain attempt to lighten the tone. Well, it must feel funny to hold it again, then. No, it feels good. Uncle Tekka tilted the blade, watching ripples of light flow up and down the edge. Thank you for returning it. A little frown creased Glauman's forehead. You can't be serious. Tekka said nothing. You gave that to me, Glauman said. Now you've given it back. But, come on now, be a reasonable man. This sword is my property. What you're proposing is theft. I take a sword and it's theft. You take a whole island. What's that? That was war, Mr. Tekka. Buddy, I thought it was real life. Just give him back the sword, Uncle. I tried to keep my voice steady. It's his now. The island is his, my uncle countered. The least he can give me is one bit of steel. Now, look, said Davison. The war's over, and this island wasn't yours to begin with. Is it? Well, if not for the sake of the island, then what about for all those boys? Oh, don't look so confused. The ones with the guns, most of them younger than your daughter. Your Marines rounded them up. You remember now how they looked on wet concrete, full of bullets? Glauman's face had gone pale and bright with sweat. I don't know what you're talking about. Is the war over for them? Said Tekka. Or are they still dead? Dad, said Bree. I didn't order that, said Glauman. You were the ranking officer. You know those Marines wouldn't have listened if I tried to stop them. I don't know that, because you never tried. Silence. You could let me take the sword and walk away, and that could be the end of it. Glauman said nothing. But you won't, will you? Glauman said nothing. Your kind never can. Glauman's face hardened. That sword, he said, is mine. Swords belong to those that hold them, Tekka said. Didn't you teach me that? The two men stared at one another. After a moment, Glauman told us, I think you kids should leave. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/thewrongstation. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This week's episode, Floating Kuzon, was written by Alexander Saxton and performed by Anthony Botello. Thank you to Orange Juice, Peter Kim, Newt Gilman, Corey Smith, Amanda Lisiaga, Miguel Guerrero, Rachel B., and Paul Kenny for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botello, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media at The Wrong Station and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.